After graduating from college, I recently moved to a new town, and I'm still trying to get settled in. I got a job at this local market, basically unloading trucks. The pay is pretty decent, and it's really just a placeholder job until I can get a better one in my field. More than anything, I like the scenery of the surrounding area of my job. The building is located right on the side of a lake, so when you're outside loading trucks, you get to stare at a very beautiful sight. When I moved here, I really didn't take much with me. It's only a small studio apartment anyway. I've recently started picking things up every week though, to make my little apartment feel more like a home. The one thing I don't have, and I'd severely underestimated the price for, was a stand for my TV. You see, I have this 60-inch TV that's just kinda sitting on the ground. It looks sorta ridiculous, and kind of unsafe maybe. My friend from work told me to check out the Facebook Marketplace, and I gotta be honest, I was a bit on the fence. I remember growing up and everyone talking about how sketchy places like Craigslist really were. I just assumed the Marketplace was the new version of that. The friend who told me about the Marketplace showed me a whole bunch of pictures on his phone of stuff that he'd bought from there. He got all of it for real cheap too. Basically, he got an entire living room set in perfect condition for only $100. He explained to me that a lot of people were always looking to get rid of old stuff. Sometimes they'd practically give it away for next to nothing. We searched for TV stands together, and I was excited to see all the different kinds on the marketplace for way cheaper than I was expecting. The first one I clicked on I loved. The stand was specifically for a 60-inch TV like mine. The woman listing it said she needed to get rid of it right away because she was moving at the end of the month. She was only asking for $25 for this beautiful, exquisite wooden stand. I understand for many this may be a red flag, but because I was listening to so many people telling me how good the deals were on here, I just assumed this was completely normal. I didn't even bother looking at this woman's profile or any information. I only grabbed the contact information in the post and messaged her right away. I got a response back within minutes, and we exchanged some more messages, talking about the stand. I told her I really wanted it. And this is where things started to get a little bit weird. Our schedules didn't exactly line up, and she told me she only had a few more days to get rid of this thing. I told her I worked Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., but she worked 2 p.m. to midnight. I wasn't going to drive 30 minutes away at midnight, when I had to wake up 4:30 in the morning the next day for work. She then suggested to me that she could meet me at the lake by my job at 5 a.m., just before I was due to start work. Not far away from my working area was a parking lot where you could park for a while if you wanted to. You could walk the various trails along the lake too. We agreed to meet up there at 5 the next day, and I would purchase the stand. I'll be honest, I felt a little bit bad about making her do this, when I wouldn't make the late-night trip to go see her. She claimed that she didn't mind though, and she was willing to do whatever she needed to do to get rid of this stand. I was just happy to finally get my TV off the ground. The next morning was one of those damp and foggy mornings. If it wasn't for the fact I was getting my TV stand, I probably would have hit the snooze button 2 or 3 times. I pulled into the parking lot of the lake just a few minutes before the arranged meeting time. I parked right in the center of the big lot and pulled out my phone. I sent her a message saying that I was there and to message me whenever she got there. No need to hurry though. A few minutes later, I got a message from her. It said something like, "Sorry, I'm just seeing this. I'm actually here already. I'm in the van parked right by the big tree in the corner." I looked around, and sure enough, in the very back corner of the lot was a van. It was so dark at this time that I hadn't even noticed it was there when I pulled in. I started to drive over, and as my headlights were illuminating this van, I realized there was nobody inside. I stopped my car, still quite a bit of distance away, and messaged her again. "Hey, there's no one in that van. Are you sure this is you?" She responded right away. "Yeah, I'm just in the back getting ready. Pull up next to the van and open the back hatch and I'll get it for you." Something felt very wrong and off about all of this. I slowly pulled up next to the van, but I did not get out. I kept my doors locked and my car running. Instantly, she messaged me again. "Are you going to get out or what?" I didn't respond. I started to reverse, so my taillights were hitting the windshield of the van. I clearly noticed that no one was inside, and no lights were on at all either. I couldn't understand why someone wouldn't just get out instead of trying to do all this. Instead of sticking around to figure it all out, I decided to simply drive away. I looked into my rearview mirror, only to see that behind the tree next to the van, 2 people were emerging. They were holding something in their hands, but I couldn't tell what it was since it was so dark. I didn't drive back to work just yet. I drove down to a local gas station to get some coffee. I was shaking because of the gravity of what just happened. It really started to set in while I was sitting in my car in the gas station parking lot. I got a message from that woman again. "Good call, bro." I tried to inform the police, but I saw the listing was now gone, and so was that profile. They did take all my information, so I'm not sure if there's a way they can find the seller otherwise. I was terrified for days after, and I'm still pretty freaked out. I swear I thought I saw that van following me a week ago, but I'm sure it was just my paranoia. I realize I'm lucky to have made it out unharmed at all. It did make me also realize just how quickly something horrible can happen if you're not paying attention. Be careful meeting anyone online, because there are some truly evil people out there. When I was 16, I got a weird feeling and opened my blinds late one night with the lights off. Needless to say, I was quite startled to find someone's face pressed right up against my window. This was deep in the suburbs, where we had only one streetlight in our cul-de-sac. It was pitch black outside, so I couldn't make out anything beside this face. I couldn't bring myself to move or say anything. It was just this pale face pressed right into the glass staring in. It's almost like he hadn't really been looking at anything at all until I opened my blinds. My heart stopped in my chest. I tried to scream, but nothing would come out of my throat. I couldn't even tell if we were making eye contact. That's how dark it was. As my eyes fully adjusted to the darkness, though, I could finally make out more of this face. I felt needles throughout my veins as a kind of pain that's hard to describe washed over me. The man's eyes were bug-eyed wide, and he grinned as though he could sense my fear through the window. I could see the whites of his eyes just 2 feet away from mine. His teeth were extremely rotten. He must have been on drugs or something, because his expression was absolutely insane. He was not blinking or moving at all, just locking his eyes with mine and following them wherever they looked. It was sickening. I bolted out of my room to wake my parents. I took one look back. The man was still there, grinning and wide-eyed. We called the cops right away and huddled in the kitchen with knives in the pitch-black darkness. We heard nothing but silence. The silence was the worst part. I wished I could have heard anything else, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Even the sound of this predator smashing through the window would have been less terrifying than this eerie silence. The cops came within only 10 minutes, although it felt like an hour in the moment. The cops did a thorough search, and they found an obvious face print on my window. To my surprise, though, there were other face prints on all the other windows surrounding my house. My parents' room, our kitchen, who knows how long he'd been out there staring inside. I don't think they ever caught him in the end. There was a small patch of woods behind our backyard. The cops suggested that he'd probably come through there, and that we should think about putting up a fence in the future. I've never opened the blinds at night since then. even after moving away years later and living in a condo on the 20th floor. My wife and I had just purchased our first home and had our first child as well. The house was still being built by the builders, so we would drive past every so often just to look and see how the house was coming along. We started visiting the house at night as well, only to notice that at some point there was a car parked out front of our house. It was quite strange, but we figured it was just one of the workers, perhaps leaving their car overnight. Sometimes the car would be there, and sometimes it wouldn't be. We didn't really think that much of it. Fast forward a few months though, and our house was now fully built. The house was empty, and we were slowly moving everything in during the first week. As for the mysterious car, it started showing up late at night again, but not parking directly in front of the house anymore. It would always park about 50 feet away at a nearby park. Now keep in mind, we were the only house on the block currently, as this was a brand new development. We were literally the first house that had been built. So there we were, just this lonesome house in the middle of the desert, a few blocks away from the nearest neighborhood. My wife demanded that we buy a security system, and so I did. She spent many nights alone, since I had to work the graveyard shift. It was my day off, so I spent it organizing stuff from the moving boxes and hanging out with my 6-month-old son. My wife was at work, and I realized there were no diapers. I called my mother-in-law and asked if she could swing by today to drop some off. I told her I'd leave the front door unlocked because I'd be taking a nap with my son. A few hours later, my son was fast asleep on the bed, and I decided to go and cuddle up with him. I laid down next to him when I heard the door chime of my security alarm for the front door. I knew it was my mother-in-law though, and I really didn't feel like talking to her. I figured I would just lay there and pretend to be asleep. I had to hope she wouldn't come upstairs. I heard her footsteps though coming up the bottom of the stairs, moving very slowly. I thought that was quite weird, but I figured she must know we were sleeping and didn't want to wake us up. My back was facing the door to my bedroom. I heard the door open as I continued to pretend to be asleep. I stayed still, and I heard a quick breath of air, as if she was startled to see us sleeping together. No other noise was made. I assumed the person must have just been standing there. I thought to myself, okay, you can go away now. It took a full minute or two though before I heard her slowly tiptoeing out of my room, back downstairs, and then out the front door. As soon as I heard the door chime, I popped out of bed and walked downstairs to grab the diapers, only to find they weren't there. I thought to myself, what the hell? She showed up and didn't even leave them. I ran over to the front window, and she was already gone. During this whole event, my phone had been off and charging, so I finally turned it on to see that I had a new voicemail. It was from my mother-in-law. "Sorry, honey, I can't come over today and bring those diapers. I got caught up in some other plans, so have a nice nap." I recently acquired a new roommate. His name was Greg, and he told me he had some strange sleeping behaviors. He would sleepwalk apparently, and had night terrors fairly frequently. Funny thing was, I also had a history of sleepwalking, but only on rare occasions. The first incident occurred about 1 week later, when I heard him screaming in the middle of the night. Since we slept on different sides of the house, the screams sounded distant. They were enough to scare me though, so I ran and checked on him. As I got closer to his bedroom, he stopped screaming, so I just decided to go back to bed instead. For the entire next month, he had no issues. I noticed that he seemed to have no friends or family that would visit him though, and I never saw him on the phone or texting. Another random night, Greg started screaming. Same thing. I got up and started to go to his room, but he would stop before I could get there. One night, though, I was awoken by screaming in my bedroom. I couldn't see anything in the panic, so I turned on the bedside lamp. He was at the foot of my bed, wearing pajamas. It scared the hell out of me, so I started screaming too. That woke him up, and he apologized. Apparently, he had been sleepwalking. He went back to bed soon after. The scariest thing happened about 2 nights later, though. I woke up to some clanking. It sounded like tools or hammers tapping. I turned on the light to see Greg kneeling down in a corner, working on something with his hands. A few seconds after turning the light on, Greg froze in place, then slowly turned his upper body around and stared blankly at me. I lay there in bed beyond creeped out. I slowly slid out and left the house. After sleeping in my truck down the road in an empty church parking lot, I returned home at around 8 in the morning. Greg was nowhere to be found. All of his belongings were gone too. There were no signs of him anywhere. It was like he'd never lived there at all. I didn't know any of his friends or family, so I had no one to call and ask about him. When I moved out after the lease was up, I was moving furniture out of my bedroom in the corner of the room, where I'd last saw Greg kneeling down that night. I realized the floor vent for the air conditioning was loose. Inside the floor vent, I could barely see an envelope. I pulled it out, only to find tons of pictures of me sleeping. The pictures all had handwritten dates and times on the back of them. The only other item was a whittled down wooden broom handle, brought to a full point. I truly believed that Greg had been preparing to kill me that night. It appeared that Greg had been coming to my room almost nightly and working on making that broom handle a stabbing weapon. I never heard until the last night I saw him. I work the PM shift and get done around midnight or so. I was walking into the grocery store when a man from across the parking lot started catcalling me. I can deal with this much. As a woman, I'm pretty much used to it. He started walking quickly toward me though, and I started to get a little bit nervous. It's midnight, it's dark, I'm on edge. He started commenting on my hair, which was dyed green at the time, saying he liked my scrubs from work and asking if I had a boyfriend. I simply blew him off and rushed into the store. I came out about 20 minutes later, only to see he was still there, standing about 20 feet away from my car. As I approached, he started up with the same stuff again. I was trying to laugh it off, even though I'm pretty sure he was trying to murder me or something at this point. I finally got to my car door and was putting everything inside when he said this. "Hey Lee!" I slowly turned around as he walked up to me and said in a very sinister voice, "Yeah, I know you." I asked him how he knew my name. "Oh, don't worry about it. You're gonna know me much better." I was frozen and about to push the panic button on my car alarm when his mood suddenly turned from crazy serial killer to goofy best friend. He patted me on the arm and said, "Don't worry too much. You're good people." He then asked me if I had any cocaine, which obviously I did not. He scoffed and jumped into a car nearby, then drove away very quickly. Needless to say, I was very confused and alarmed for the rest of the night. During the summer when I was 17, I was waiting for a friend to come over to my house while my family was out of the country. We planned on playing video games all night long. I live in a small city of 7,000 people in France near Paris, and the houses are few and far away from each other. I also live in front of a small park that gets very dark and scary at night. There's no one around if you're in trouble. Around 11 p.m. or so, my friend called me up on the phone and told me to open the door for them. There was apparently somebody following them. We don't usually have any problems with violence in our neighborhood, but some young kids do sometimes try to steal your stuff when you're alone in the street. I ran downstairs to open the door and looked outside to see my friend swiftly walking up my driveway and closing the gate behind him. I opened the door and he rushed inside, telling him someone had been following him the entire time and telling him they were going to kill him. I watched outside for 20 to 30 seconds, but nothing happened. Suddenly though, just as I was about to turn around and forget about it, the motion light turned on. I saw a huge man running into my driveway and closing the gate behind him. I looked at the house door, just waiting for that guy to try and open it. Exactly 2 seconds later, the man hit the door with force as hard as he could. He started yelling through it that my friend was going to die. He demanded he open the door. He kept on slamming against it again and again with his full body. We ran upstairs and locked 2 different doors behind us before locking ourselves in another room, where I then called the cops. I told them to hurry as the man was actively trying to get inside. My friend and I were terrified, especially because we didn't know this guy at all. For a full 5 minutes, the stranger kept pounding on my door and trying to break it down. All of a sudden, though, there was total silence. I couldn't see what was happening from the area we were in, and I was too scared to go look outside. The only thing I could see were the motion lights turning off and on all around the house for 10 minutes after that. Everything was silent and dark. I was sure the guy was skulking about outside. I immediately thought he must have managed to get inside the house, either by breaking a window or something else. The police took 40 minutes to arrive. 40 minutes of pure terror. We were so relieved when we saw the blue lights stop in front of my driveway. The creepier thing, though, was still yet to come. There were 5 policemen in total, and I yelled out from my window that I didn't know where the guy was anymore. He might still be in the house, so they had to be careful. 3 of them went to check the backyard, while the other 2 were investigating the front area. 5 minutes later, the 3 guys that went to the back opened the front door from the inside and told us to stay locked in that room because there was a broken window. The guy probably was inside the house still. It took them another 10 minutes to find him. He was hiding in the bathroom upstairs in the closet. They arrested him after a brief fight. The man claimed he didn't know where he was or why he was there, and he was hiding in the closet because he was so scared. I didn't sleep for weeks after, and that person will forever haunt my slumbering moments. A few years ago, my wife and I went to a haunted corn maze a couple of days before Halloween. We had been drinking a little bit, so we managed to get lost as hell inside. We had wandered around for about 20 minutes or so when this weird-looking guy started to follow us around. We made a turn and ended up at a dead end. When we turned around to find a different way, the guy was right there blocking the exit. Extremely calmly, he looked both of us over and said, "You know, some psycho could come in here and kill people. Everyone would just think it was part of the show." It scared the shit out of us. I have no idea if this guy worked for the maze or what, but we got the hell out of there. We just cheated and started running through the walls of the maze. We never saw the guy again after, so we didn't get any closure on the matter either. I pride myself on my car trip taking patience. I never rush, I take frequent breaks, and I try to generally enjoy the trip as much as possible. Sometimes this can lead to me staying overnight in random hotels. I was in Connecticut. My friend's wedding had come and gone, and I needed to get home. I really didn't know my friend's family all that well, so I didn't feel comfortable staying behind with them. I was getting very tired, and my eyes were starting to close on their own. I began driving off the road even. As I was not really anywhere near home, I figured I'd stop at the first hotel I could find. My GPS guided me to a Best Western, but it was all booked up for a biker gang weekend, I guess. The next hotel I found was off the beaten path. At this point, it was quite late, and I was so tired I didn't even care. I checked in, and they handed me a key made out of real metal, a real old-fashioned looking key. That's the kind of place this seemed to be. I found my room, unlocked it, walked in, and relocked the door, only to find there was no deadbolt or safety chain. Then, in a quick text to my wife, I let her know I wasn't going to be home until tomorrow afternoon. I was so tired I walked over to the bed and crashed entirely. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, though, I woke up, not really sure why I'd done so. I soon found, though, that I could not get back to sleep. Everything seemed to be too quiet. Usually, I sleep at home with a box fan for white noise, but here there was nothing. No air conditioner, no hum of the refrigerator, no neon lights to buzz noisily outside my window. The night was completely still. What was extra weird is that I didn't even hear footsteps or any cars or anything. You would think that it being so quiet, I would have heard something beforehand, but all of a sudden, I heard the sound of a key rattling in the lock of my door. It seemed to take an extraordinary amount of time, so long that I clearly remember thinking someone must have the wrong room. I was building up the courage to shout that exact thing when the key clicked. For 3 seconds or so, which seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. Then the doorknob slowly turned. I'm not sure if the moon was super bright that night or if I'd been tossing and turning so long that the sun had just started to come up, but there was enough light that I could see the outline of a person. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or so, wearing a hat. It was a baseball cap covering his face. Whoever it was had long hair down to their shoulders. They were thin, but not exactly skinny. They must have had a quilted vest on or something too, because they seemed kind of knobby around the shoulder area. I must have gone over the next 30 seconds a trillion times in my head. I got up to run over to the door and shout and raise a scene. I was going to be brave and scare this person off, at least turn on a light and let them know they couldn't be here. I was going to be courageous in the face of this unexpected intruder. In reality, though, I just lie there holding my breath and didn't move a muscle. My eyes felt like they would fall out of my head because I had them open so wide, desperately trying to make sense of this situation, to have some detail come into focus that would right this obviously wrong scene. There was an eerie silence as nothing happened. The figure just stood in the doorway. I knew my eyes must be playing tricks on me, but it almost seemed like his fingers started growing. The person wasn't moving. They were just standing there with their arms by their side, like they were posing for a magazine or something. We were locked in this stalemate for I'm not sure how long. In situations like this, it really hammers home that time is a construct of human invention. There's no exact measurement, really. Almost a lifetime passed by when finally the figure cleared their throat. They turned around and walked away, leaving my door wide open. I waited there, sitting and waiting for my heart to calm down and trying to convince myself this was all a dream. Eventually, I climbed out of bed, convinced a noise was going to alert the figure that I was here. I grabbed my bag and crept out to my car. I drove away as fast as I possibly could. Later, I got a bill from the hotel for $20 to replace the key that I drove away with. When I was just out of high school, I didn't have a car. The concept of public transportation around here is about as foreign as letting strangers in off the street into your house and offering them a 5-course dinner. So I walked everywhere and everywhere that was within 15 miles. I was working at a fast food restaurant that was about a 45-minute walk away from my house, usually working 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. I personally loved that shift. It was usually quiet when I got out of work, and I could just walk in silence and think to myself, relax and listen to all the sounds of the night. That all changed, though, after I met this person. I was walking home like normal, my uniform shirt thrown over my shoulder, enjoying the feeling of the breeze, when I saw someone across the street, about 300 yards in front of me. All I could really see, though, was their silhouette against the front porch light of a house down the road. There were not exactly many street lights on these back roads in this county, so it was usually very dark. Something about this guy just seemed to be really off, though. I thought I could see him holding something, perhaps a knife, but then again, it was dark, and my mind was trying to scare me. I cautiously continued forward, reaching into my pocket and gripping my pocket knife as I approached this silhouette. I could sort of see his slightly darker shape against the black pine trees behind him. I knew for sure now I could see a knife in his hand. At this moment, my mind clicked as well that he wasn't walking like a normal person. He was kind of walking crouched down. I wasn't sure what to do. He was right between me and my house. The back roads don't connect to each other either. I know homeless people live in the woods around here, and some of them are okay. Some of them aren't. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but I'm not sure what exactly I could do. I stood there and watched as he approached closer and got within probably 100 feet of me. Now I could hear he seemed to be saying something. I couldn't quite make out what it was, but I could hear him making some noise. I could also see he was swinging something in his other hand. Again, though, it was dark and hard to make out exactly what was going on. I backed off the road a bit and put the drainage ditch in between us. I never took my eyes off the man as he continued to approach me. I could see that he did indeed have a rather large knife, and the other object he appeared to be swinging around was a dead cat. The warning lights were going off in my head now, but I still didn't know what to do. I was just hoping a car would drive by. He eventually was right across the street from me and stopped in place. I could hear him much better now. It almost sounded like he was chanting or reciting some verse over and over again. He turned his full body to face me and roared at me at the top of his lungs. I booked it towards my house, looking over my shoulder at every turn. He was always right behind me. I ran faster than I think I ever have in my entire life, and he kept with me pace for pace, swinging his knife and that dead cat every step of the way. I was not about to lead him to my house, though. My mom and sister were both home, and my dad was out of town for work. I ran as fast as I could, passing the road I lived on. I went for as long as I could, but I could feel the burn and the pain, that wobble that forecasts your knees giving out. I turned and looked back over my shoulder. He was still there, but now much further away. I tried to make it to a friend's house that I knew was home and most likely still awake. About 50 feet away from his fence, though, I felt a pop and a grinding. There was an intense pain in my knee as my knees went out and I fell forward. Grasping my knees and trying to curl into a ball, the pain was intense. I hit the ground with my shoulder and rolled. I remembered why I was running, and I looked behind me. The man was nowhere to be seen. I crawled desperately toward my friend's fence, getting back on my feet eventually and running the rest of the way. I jumped over his fence before collapsing on the other side against it. I landed on my leg, shouting in pain, and crawled across the rest of his yard. I started beating on the bottom of the door before my friend came and opened it. I saw his very irritated father coming down the stairs. They both stopped short, though, when they noticed how badly I looked. I explained what happened, and they both looked at me like I was speaking in tongues. I had to go through it all twice before my friend agreed to drive me home. I was watching the entire way, but I never saw that man along the road. We got home, and my friend waited till I was inside before he left. I changed my clothes, got in the shower, and stayed there until the water went cold, trying to wrap my head around everything. I eventually calmed down and finally laid down to go to sleep. Around 5 a.m. though, something knocked on my window. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Then it happened again though, so I got out of bed to go look at what was happening. The man was standing right outside my window, smiling at me. I shouted and woke everyone else up in the house. I called the police, but they didn't show up for a half hour, by which time he was already long gone. I couldn't sleep for a month after. I stopped walking home from work, and I started carrying more than just a pocket knife on me if I ever had to walk alone outside after dark. I still have some trouble sleeping at night. I've never seen the man again, but I swear sometimes at night when I'm standing outside, I can almost feel someone watching me. I remember back when I was in university, I liked to watch zombie movies a lot back then. Late one night, at about 3 a.m. after finishing a watching session, I went to get something to drink from the kitchen. As I happened to look outside the window, I noticed there was a person standing in the middle of the road at the end of my street. They were far enough away that I couldn't really make out anything about them. They were just a sort of shadowy figure. I watched them for about 15 minutes. They didn't really move other than some idle swaying back and forth. I decided it must not be that big a deal. My imagination was getting the best of me. I decided to go watch another movie. After that movie, I went to the kitchen window again, and sure enough, the figure was still there. This time though, a car drove by while I was watching, and I watched as the figure began to run after it, then stopped after whoever it was had already driven away. I went to sleep, but whoever that was outside was gone when I woke up. It really creeped me out though, enough that I still remember that weird zombie man 10 years later. When I was about 11 or 12, I rode the school bus with this tall, skinny boy that lived down the street. He was my age and known in the neighborhood as being a very odd kid. On the bus and in school, he would just stare at me with these cold and unblinking wild eyes that sank deep into his face. One night, alone in my bedroom, I took off my school clothes and changed into my pajamas. I stood there in front of my mirror, buttoning up my top, when I suddenly got the feeling I was being watched. As I looked over, I saw his hungry, wild eyes in the corner of my mirror. I froze, realizing he had been standing outside my bedroom window in the pitch-black night, watching me undress. When I turned around to face my window, he was just standing right there, staring in at me with no expression on his face. It was just this emotionless void of life, except for his terrifying eyes. I screamed as loud as I could, and he ran away into the night. We continued to go to school together for the next 2 years, but he never stopped staring at me. The image haunts me still, as well as the notion that that night he'd walked over to my house for over 3 miles in 20-degree weather in the pitch-black night just to spy on me. I almost wonder how many times he continued to do that over the years. My husband and I were on a road trip, coming back from Louisiana from Iowa. We would drive in 4-hour shifts while the other person slept in the back. It was about 2 a.m. or so, and he woke me up to start my shift. I looked around and didn't see any other cars in sight, or even a streetlight or single building. He told me he had taken an alternate route that he thought would be faster. Eventually, we came across a small local gas station with a single light on it. It appeared to be closed, and our car was the only one present. We pulled over, and I was getting ready to open the door so we could switch places. My husband stopped me though and told me to hold on for a moment. I looked up and saw that from behind the back of the gas station, a man wearing rags was shambling towards us. He was moving quickly, but not quite running. That only made the sight even scarier though. I told my husband to hurry up and drive away. He was intrigued though. He stared ahead as the man got closer and closer. I started freaking out and screaming for him to go until he finally did so. As he drove away, I looked behind us until the gas station disappeared. As far as I could see, the man continued to follow the car at that same odd pace he was walking until I could no longer see him at all. The sight of that man in the darkness still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I live in Tennessee, and every year we have a music festival called River Bend on the Tennessee River. The end of this festival is celebrated with one of the best fireworks shows in the world. It's hard to get into or even get close to the festival on the last day. It's like everyone in the southeast United States wants to come and see these fireworks. My best friend Tara and I wanted to find a good vantage point that would overlook the river and watch the fireworks together. We drove up to a ridge nearby and pulled off into a gravel parking lot where we found several other people with the same idea as us. Even though some trees were in the way, we noticed a trail that went down the ridge further. We walked about 40 yards down this trail when we came upon a clearing where we could see the river perfectly. We were talking and waiting for the fireworks to start when we started to hear this rustling noise from further down the trail. I thought I could make out the silhouette of a person moving between some trees down the ridge. Tara had a small keychain flashlight, which she took out and shined down the trail. We didn't see anything at that moment, but we kept hearing the rustling. Eventually, we chalked it up to just being a squirrel or wild animal. The fireworks soon started, and had been going on for about a minute or so, when I heard a stick break right next to me. We both turned around to look, but we couldn't see anything because it was so dark. Tara turned on her light again, only to find that there was a man standing there, literally 5 feet away from me. It was so dark in this area that we couldn't see him at all until the light was on him. It was just like a horror movie scene. We immediately got up and started heading back up the trail. The whole way the man was following us. He began to call out to us too. "Where are you going? What are your names? What are you two pretty little things doing out here all alone?" We ignored him and kept walking. Apparently that made him angry, because he started threatening us to get back there or else nobody would ever hear our screams over the fireworks. "I have a knife. You don't even know my name. Nobody would ever catch me if I hurt you both." We started running, and we got to the top of the hill where 2 kids were playing. I saw their dad standing further back. I called out to the kids that their dad wanted them, so they would go closer to him and be safe from this creepy guy following us. I then walked a bit closer and asked the dad if it was okay if we stood with him, at least until the man was gone. He said of course, and thanked us for sending his kids in his direction. The man stood at the opening of the trail and watched us for a long time. He then finally disappeared back into the woods and out of sight. We figured he must have been watching us in the woods for at least 20 minutes before he approached. He waited until the noise of the fireworks began to approach us, to be sure he could cover the sounds of all his wrongdoings. When I was a teenager, my grandfather, who was my mom's dad, started suffering from dementia. He came to live at our house for a few years. It was a nice time being with him, but it was also sad watching him decline. The dementia went mostly as expected, strangely misplaced items and general confusion. But there was one really weird thing my grandfather did that really disturbed me and my mom. One day, he started talking about Connie. "Where did she go?" he asked. We thought he was talking about my deceased grandmother, but her name was Anne. No one in our family was named Connie, so we figured he was just confused. He kept on asking about this Connie, though. I started wondering if maybe Connie was some woman that had been in his life that none of us had ever known about. The weird stuff started happening shortly after. He would randomly have his shoes already tied by seemingly no one. He had long ago lost such motor skills to do so himself. And when asked about it, he would of course say that Connie had tied them for him. One day, he casually explained there would be a storm coming, and shortly after, it came. Again, he said that Connie had told him. There were lots of little things like this. Furniture and doors moving around, mysterious footsteps at night. Always he would say it was Connie. My mom and I started to think of this Connie as some sort of ghost, or perhaps an angel looking after him in his old age. That was until one day. He was talking about Connie again when he grabbed me suddenly and looked at me with his eyes wide and his lips trembling. He looked absolutely terrified. "Where's Connie?" he asked as usual. "She's not here," I said, which was my usual response. "Quick, shut the door. Don't let her find me before she gets me again." A creepy feeling came over me. Who was this Connie? I asked him for the millionth time, but he just put his hands over his face and started to rock back and forth moaning. After that, we heard less and less about this Connie, mostly because we were too creeped out to keep asking about all the weird noises and random things he seemed to know. One night, though, I woke up to the sound of footsteps and scratching. The footsteps were fast, like someone was running around the house. I hesitated to leave my room, scared of what I would find. I saw a figure down the hall, turning around the corner. I almost stopped there and shut my bedroom door when I heard my grandfather moaning. I realized the figure was him. "Grandpa?" I asked. I went over to him. He was scratching frantically at something. "What's wrong?" I tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned around startled. On the table was a ripped-out page from a magazine, an ad of a woman who he had scribbled and penned all over her eyes. "Connie's eyes," he whispered. My mother and I had no real way of comforting my grandfather through these nightmares and terrors he was experiencing. The doctor said it was normal for him at this stage. We all kinda sensed that he had very little time left. When he died a few months later in the hospital, the nurses told us he'd called out Connie's name in his worst times. My mother and I don't really talk about it anymore. We just kind of figured it was all a symptom of his dementia. But sometimes I think I hear weird sounds in the middle of the night. Maybe that Connie is still sticking around with us for whatever reason. When I was little, my family had a weekend cottage in the mountains of Vermont. Back then, it was still to some extent the back country and quite unspoiled. Our cottage was surrounded by woods, and there was a gravel road that formed a horseshoe, where about 7 or 8 neighboring cottages were. Oftentimes, though, there was nobody in those cottages, so we were pretty much alone for miles. Needless to say, the nighttime was extremely dark. One summer night, we were all sitting around the orange shag carpeting and watching Star Trek or something along those lines, when someone began to knock softly on the screen door. It was a woman wearing a house dress, looking very sweaty and out of breath. I must have been around 7 years old and had a brother slightly older. My dad walked over and talked to her for a moment. She explained that she needed a lift down to the village. My dad, ever the good Samaritan, said sure, no problem, let me get my keys real quick. They both left in my dad's car, leaving my mom, my brother, and I still sitting there with the screen door open watching TV on this warm, pitch-black summer night. Meanwhile, my father was driving this woman down to the village. It was a good 30 minutes each way. He began to talk to the woman and pay closer attention to her. He noticed she was barefoot and her dress was all torn and muddy. She explained that her husband lived with her in a cabin in the woods and they'd had a huge fight. She had to flee through the woods since he was apparently trying to kill her. She had lost her shoes in the chase and had to run through brambles and branches in her panic to escape. Now, my dad was at least 30 minutes away from home, and now he knew that the first house this murderous guy would encounter as he chased his wife through the woods would be our cottage. The same one where we were all sitting around completely oblivious, with every door and window wide open. Cell phones hadn't even been dreamt of yet in this era, and he had no way to reach us. He drove the woman to a friend's house and urged her to call the police. Then he sped back to the cottage, wondering if he was going to be greeted by the sight of our massacred corpses. It was a different era, I guess, because it never occurred to anyone to call the cops just in case. I still remember him getting home and calmly trying to lock every door, sitting right by it and trying not to convey to us how scared he was. That's not even the creepiest part, though. A couple of days later, my brother and I were looking around outside when we noticed hand and face marks on the back window. It appeared a tall person had pressed their face against the glass to peer inside. We explored the woods over that summer and actually found the woman's lost shoes stuck in the mud. We also found their utterly trashed cabin. Someone had absolutely destroyed the place, breaking every glass and picture frame and tossing their belongings into the woods. That was one creepy place. Unfortunately, we later heard the woman my dad helped that night committed suicide. For years afterward, my dad and I would often walk the dog out on the gravel road, and at the turn of the horseshoe that was closest to these people's cabin, we always got a really bad feeling. They were of course long gone, but the hairs on the back of my neck would just stand up on end. I would always feel watched and terrified. I always assumed my dad a common rational guy if there ever was one. He didn't seem to feel scared at all. Years later though, he confided in me that he also hated that spot. He felt very bad vibes there. Some kind of immense sense of foreboding of the unfortunate events that once occurred there long ago. So I met an agent who showed us this building, and when I tried to verify the price with her, she said it was actually several $100s cheaper than it was supposed to be. That was quite strange. Every other place that we saw nearby had lines of people and tons of competition, but strangely, we were the only ones interested in this property. She immediately called us after we left and said we could have the apartment. We were ecstatic when we filled out all the forms. Later, she mentioned there was a building manager who lived there. He was friends with the owner, who was a very old woman. He was also very old, but we should give our rent checks to him and let him know if we needed anything. Living there started off fine. The apartment was a little weird, even had an electrical socket in the shower, which I didn't think was the best. I tried my best to cover it up and make it waterproof. The manager, though, was quite strange. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head exactly why he was strange, but I just knew there was something off about him. On any given day, he would nod in our direction if we saw him, but on other days we would hear him mumbling incoherently at people that weren't there. The few times we went to him with an actual problem, he would start yelling, almost in a different language. One day, we were startled by a loud banging on our door. We opened up, only to find it was him. I was terrified. I made my husband step out front as he screamed and raved about a note we'd left on a car that was blocking our garage door, which apparently was his car. He wasn't making any sense, but it was a terrifying sight to behold. He told us he would make us pay if we ever left a note on his car again. Here's where it gets real scary. I had been trying to avoid him as much as I could at this point. He seemed extremely unhinged. Somehow there was a look in his eyes that wasn't quite right. It was obvious he was very angry with us from then on. One night I woke up in the dead of night to a noise in our hallway. We had wood floors, and they creaked whenever someone walked on them. I could hear them creaking right now. My husband was dead asleep, and I had a history of being paranoid, so I just closed my eyes and tried to fall back asleep, telling myself it was nothing. That's when a feeling of absolute horror and fear seized me. It was unlike anything I've ever felt before. I still can't even describe it to this day, except to say I was completely terrified. I couldn't move at all. It was like I was paralyzed. I managed to open my eyes, even though a part of me didn't want to, only to find that man standing there right next to the bed, watching me. I laid there in complete panic, unable to move. The man looked almost like a shadow. He shifted his feet, and the floor creaked. His breathing was hard. I wanted to scream or do anything, but I didn't know what to do. Finally, I just closed my eyes, unable to even pray. I was so scared. The floor creaked again. I opened my eyes and the man was gone. I laid awake for the rest of the night. The horrible fear that pressed against me was now gone, and I was able to move again. Tears poured down my face. The rest of the night, all I could do was lay there and cry. The next morning, I looked at the front door to see the latch was still set. No one should have been able to open the door from inside and get in without breaking it. I tried to convince myself it was just a terrible dream, but I knew I was awake when that had happened. We moved shortly after that. When we went to give notice to the manager, though, he gave us a creepy smile and said, "Now that's a real shame. You've been such good tenants." He looked at me specifically. "Didn't you love it here?" This happened about 4 years ago. I live in a resort community and started working for a local real estate agent and taking photos of homes for sale. I usually photograph 3 or 4 homes a week, lakefront and sand shacks alike. I had seen unusual things like the occasional hidden room or perhaps a unique art collection that had been left behind, but I'd never encountered anything scary. That is, until this event happened. It was a summer day, warm and bright. I knew the neighborhood I was heading to, and so I had no concerns about safety. The area was very suburban, with a large park and school nearby. I packed up my camera and drove 20 minutes to the home. Upon arrival, I began my session by taking pictures of the exterior. Nothing was out of the ordinary. After struggling to navigate the sharp slope that the home was on, I managed to snap pictures of all its sides and its rear deck. It was now time for the interior shots. I proceeded to the front door and entered the lockbox code. I tried to unlock the front door, but as I fumbled with it, I felt overwhelmingly uncomfortable. A strange feeling washed over me in that moment, and I felt like I shouldn't be there. I finally managed to get the door open and stumbled inside to find the house completely destroyed. The living room was a sea of debris. There was something lying in the middle of the room with a charred doll beside it. Holes littered the walls. The light bulbs were all smashed. It was like a scene straight out of a horror movie. I observed all of this without taking a single step further. I immediately closed the door and walked back to my car as fast as I could. I called the agent and told her what I'd found. She would need to send someone else to take pictures of this house. When she asked me why specifically, as I tried to explain it to her, I realized I might sound a little crazy. How can you professionally describe the feeling of being scared shitless for no apparent reason, other than a disgustingly filthy house? She told me she had seen many homes that were less than welcoming, but we both had a job to do here, and she couldn't complete hers without me doing mine. I decided I really didn't feel like losing my job today. I called my father, who lived locally, and asked if he'd accompany me to the house. In all my days, I had never heard my dad scared of anything remotely spooky. He's a very no-nonsense kind of man, and simply wouldn't tolerate any talk of ghosts or monsters or anything of the like. Therefore, I thought he would be the perfect person to help me with this assignment. He'd be able to keep my head in the game, so to speak. I arranged to pick him up at his house in 30 minutes. My heart sank a little as I pulled up and saw my dad's truck was missing. My mom came running out, though, and told me my father had to leave for work reasons. She would go with me instead. She brought a flashlight and assured me it would be just fine. As we drove to the house, I described to her what I'd seen. I could tell she was slightly unnerved as well. We parked in front, and I could see she really didn't want to go inside. I didn't really want her to go in either. She came up with a solution, though. She'd call my cell phone and talk to me as I walked through the house. She'd stand right outside the front door as well. I headed back inside again. Immediately upon entering, I was scared. Just for clarification, I'm not an easily scared person. I'm not one to see or feel things of that nature whatsoever. It was later in the day by this time. The house was positioned in such a way that it was shaded from the sun. The electricity was obviously off, and it was dark, very dark. My mother was on the phone reminding me to breathe. As I walked in further, I saw the toilets were completely black on the inside. The kitchen had these red smears all over the counters and walls. Children's toys were mixed in with porn magazines lying on the floor. I kept clicking, taking pictures, trying not to focus on any of the weird things inside this house. I went as quickly as I could through the main level, then came to a set of stairs leading downward. I told my mother through the cell phone I was heading down. She continued to reassure me and told me to hurry up and get it over with. I began walking extremely cautiously down the steps, one at a time. The steps led to a small landing, then turned the corner, so all I could see was a white wall at the bottom. I had a certain feeling I was going to see something bad once I turned that corner. I was only 2 or 3 steps away from turning the landing when I heard a scream come from my phone. Not a mild scream either, but a blood-curdling kind, as if someone was being murdered on the other end. I've never ran as fast as I did sprinting back up those stairs. I completely expected to find my mom lying lifeless outside the house or something. When I got to the top of the stairs, though, she was standing there looking completely terrified and perplexed. I grabbed her and we went back to the car. We drove for about 5 minutes before one of us said anything. Then she turned to me and asked why I was screaming. I told her I'd thought it was her. Neither of us had apparently done it, but we both clearly heard a woman screaming for her life. We stopped at a grocery store parking lot and sat there trying to catch our breath. When I got home, I uploaded the pictures without actually looking at them and sent them to the real estate agent. I told her she would have to do the editing on her own. I deleted the email and every single image. Because of that, I don't know the exact address of the house, nor have I driven by it since. In hindsight, I would have liked to research the property a little bit more. I'll never know what happened there, or why I got the feelings I did that day. This happened in Antioch, California. It was around 2 a.m. or so, and I was at a friend's house, all safe and warm. We were having a lot to drink, chatting and enjoying ourselves, of course. When you're having a fun time though, it's like the fast forward button, and those few moments turn into an entire hour. I'd had far too much to drink. That night, my friend had a bit of an abrupt bedtime, so I had to dodge out pretty early. Still intoxicated, I felt too shameful, thinking I'd be asking too much to stay at his house to sleep off my drunkenness. I suppose he was either too rude or too drunk to consider it himself. I'd need about an hour or so to sober up and drive back. As fast as time passed by during my stay, it decided to drastically slow down as soon as I stepped out of his house. It was a cold area, a concrete jungle, with the stem of the street breaking off into forks. Alongside the road my car was parked at, the only street light that worked was right in the middle. It was in the middle of the cul-de-sac circle, about 80 yards away. I stumbled towards my car and produced my keys. I lined the metal up and opened my door. I shifted into the back seat. This was a dark and unfamiliar neighborhood. I took some leftover newspapers and a sweater in my back seat to cover myself up. I was a little bit scared of resting in my car, actually. I wanted some camouflage for myself, not just to be some guy awkwardly sitting in his car waiting for time to pass to sober up. I couldn't manage to fall asleep though. The uncomfortable feeling of the cheap back seat, plus being shrouded in darkness, didn't make slumber any easier. It felt kind of ominous, actually. Of course, my mind began to wander, and I thought of worst-case scenarios, like how the police might shine their lights in on me through the window, or a drunk driver might hit my car. In the distance, about 100 yards away or so, I could hear some footsteps approaching. The gravel scuffed with each step forward, growing in loudness as their proximity increased. Periodically, the person would just randomly stop. I wondered why. It clicked in my mind, though. Whoever this was probably looking into each car with the intent to steal something. I couldn't recall how many cars were on the block, but I counted 3 full stops until he was at my window. I froze there, listening to his breathing. There was no more than a foot between us. The car was the only thing encapsulating me as I lay hidden behind backseat clutter. I did my best to look like an object and be unnoticeable. I didn't want to move or check the window. I remained clutter. My body reacted by minimizing my breathing so much that I felt almost paralyzed. I dared not to look, my eyes fixated on the back of the passenger seat. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe, really. My heart was pounding so hard, my entire body was shaking. The man continued to circle around my car. I could feel him touching the trunk as he carefully pressed down on it, as if to test the alarm, as if to test me. I was in the middle of a fight-or-flight reaction, and I couldn't do either without elevating the danger. I froze and hoped to God this guy was bluffing. He circled the car once more, and the door handle to my right began to jiggle. He seemed to be getting more and more agitated and stressed with each pull. I was convinced he was trying to make me move and reveal myself. My muscles were tensed up, like a cow before slaughter. I heard a tap at my window. A crowbar? A knife? A rock? A gun, perhaps? My eyes stayed fixated on the seat in front of me, never averting my gaze. I couldn't see anything. I could feel eyes resting atop me, though. My mind forced a visual into my head. I had already accepted death. Surely I was about to be shot or something, or maybe he'd break the window and stab me. I just prayed it would not be excruciating as I died. I imagined my friend waking up the next morning after a calm night of safe and sound sleep, only to discover my mutilated and defiled body hanging outside my car door or something. It was then, though, that all the sounds stopped. I could feel the person just staring at me in the middle of the night. Time froze before the footsteps began to be swallowed into the distance. It seemed he was walking away. I waited another hour until the sun came up, and then I jumped in my front seat and drove away wide-eyed and sober. This happened about 1 year ago. To be clear, I live with my mother, father, and 2 brothers. My dad is a truck driver, so he's gone pretty much constantly. My other brother was visiting his girlfriend in Peru when this all happened, so it was just me, one of my brothers, and my mom in the house. One particular night around 12 a.m. or so, I was heading to bed and decided to get a glass of water. I headed back downstairs while drinking the water and decided to look out the tiny window my door had. That's when I noticed a shadow in the front yard. At first, I thought I was just seeing things, but I decided to keep looking. There was definitely someone out there. I wasn't sure exactly what to do, mainly because this person just seemed to be standing there, not doing anything at all. He wasn't trying to break in or peer in or anything like that. I stood there just watching him stand still for a good 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, he didn't even move a single muscle. It was almost like he was a statue or something. All of a sudden, though, I noticed another man come out of nowhere. From what I could see, it seemed like they were talking to each other. About a minute or two goes by, and they both disappeared. They moved to the side of the house and jumped the fence to get into our backyard. I freaked out and woke up my mom and brother. I probably should have woken them up to begin with, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing. We called the cops, but at this point in time, there were a couple of car accidents out, so they said it would take them 20 to 30 minutes to get there. We locked ourselves in my mom's room and waited, hoping they wouldn't come in. While waiting, we heard the garage door open. We started to hear things being thrown around in the garage. They were in there for 15 minutes. The cops finally showed up, though, and caught and arrested both of the men, who were apparently still there. It turns out they were both really strung out on drugs. I learned my lesson that night, though, to call the cops immediately if you see something suspicious. You never know what might really be happening. A while ago, during the NHL lockout, I was up at 3 a.m. in the morning, watching the World Juniors. That was when I noticed a van pulling into my cul-de-sac. It was very strange, because I didn't recognize this van. It certainly wasn't the van of any of my neighbors. The van stopped right in front of my house, and 3 people got out. 2 of the people went to my neighbor's house to the right, and the other came to mine. They were all dressed in black and were moving pretty quickly. I was pretty much frozen when I heard footsteps approaching my door. Then nothing happened though. Literally nothing. The van drove away without anyone getting back in. I never saw the guy at my doorstep leaving out the windows either. It was snowing that night, so in the morning I had to go shovel my driveway. I could visibly see the man's steps going right up to my front door and then stopping right there. There were no tracks leaving though, nor were there any anywhere else. I don't exactly know what happened that night, but it was very strange. I was never much afraid of anything. I was an avid hiker, a championship swimmer, and even went skydiving once. I was never as terrified, though, as when someone decided to terrorize me in my own home. It was 2 years ago, and I'll never forget the first night it happened. It was a Sunday, and my parents had taken off to England that afternoon to visit my elderly grandmother. Since they'd be gone for a week and a half, and I had a new job I couldn't take time off of yet, I had to stay home and look after the house. I was just out of college a few months prior, and still living at home while I saved up for a place of my own. The property my parents lived on was fairly isolated. It had a long, winding driveway that extended about a half-mile from the road. Our nearest neighbor was probably 2 miles away. In the living room, the couch was right under this big bay window, and that's where I found myself on this particular evening. I was flipping through channels on my parents' 55-inch TV while sipping some wine and glancing at texts on my phone. It was a quiet night. I had one text from my boss Maggie. "Hey, can you be at work 8:30 tomorrow instead of 9?" The answer was of course yes. I must have dozed off at some point though, because I woke up around midnight. I clicked off the TV and, too lazy to go upstairs to my bedroom, I turned back over to the couch and went back to sleep. I was woken up suddenly at 2 a.m. to a loud noise jolting me out of my sound sleep. It took about 15 seconds to process that someone was at the window directly above me, pounding on the glass repeatedly. My blood ran cold, and I felt my heart beat in my throat. The window was positioned in such a way that while I was on the couch, someone looking in shouldn't even be able to see me unless I moved very visibly. I stayed completely still as the pounding continued. I was so terrified that I didn't even want to grab my phone. I didn't want whoever it was out there to see the light. After about 2 minutes of pounding on the glass, tears in my eye, the terror grew to an unimaginable level. That was when I heard a second person pounding on the front door. The front door was on the same wall as the bay window. It took everything in me not to scream, but at the same time, I don't think I could have if I tried to. The banging went on until about 4:15, when everything abruptly stopped. I had so much adrenaline running through my body, I couldn't bring myself to even look at my phone until daylight arrived. This was winter in northern Michigan, and this was private property. There was no reason anyone should have been outside in those freezing temperatures, pounding on my window and door for hours. Thankfully, my parents' garage is connected directly to our house. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have even gone to work out of fear. As I backed out of the garage, everything looked normal. It had been too cold to snow in this past week, so there were no footprints. I tried to rationalize what happened all day at work. I absent-mindedly answered the phone, made copies, and tried to pinpoint who could have been out there. It surely wasn't my parents, as they'd alerted me that day that they'd landed safely in London. Most of my friends were out of town that I knew of, and none of them were the type to play such a prank. I really didn't want to go back to the house alone that night after work, but I had to. I picked up some Chinese takeout, got home, and locked all the doors. I checked everything twice and poured myself a big glass of wine. I was calming down a little and told myself it must have been a fluke, some idiots messing around drunk. It didn't make any sense why drunk people would be on our property in the middle of the night, but who knows? Maybe it was someone attempting to be funny and failing miserably. I drew the curtains and kept the TV on all night. This time though, at around 2:10 a.m., I knew what happened the night before had not been a fluke, because it happened again. Pounding on the same window, pounding at the front door. Carefully, I picked up my phone and dialed 911. It wasn't until about 2:45 that the police showed up, and the knocking had ceased about 15 minutes prior. I begged them to look around the property, which they did. This is the part where I wish I could tell you they found some dumb teenagers out in the woods or something, not wanting to get caught smoking by their parents. But they didn't. They found no signs of anyone. The next day, I had a very awkward conversation with a male coworker of mine. I knew that Jeff was single and had a place in the city. I let him in on what was going on. He was genuinely concerned for my safety. "I hate to ask this of you," I said, trembling, "but do you think you could stay over the night?" Jeff showed up at about 8 p.m. with some snacks, and we ended up talking together until around 1. We fell asleep on separate couches in the living room. Nothing happened that night, and Jeff stayed with me for the next 3 nights in a row. Nothing happened as long as Jeff was there. I bought him lunch on Friday at work for all his trouble. By then, my parents were due back in town the following Sunday. If you can believe it, I was starting to feel a lot better. Then though, it happened again. 1:37 a.m., pounding on the window in the living room. This time though, I was not only afraid, I was completely livid. I pushed the fear aside and let my anger do the talking for me. I screamed at the top of my lungs. "What the hell do you want from me? Get off my property or I'll blow your head off. I'm armed." Honestly, I was not, but as angry as I felt, I wanted to fight off whoever was out there. I thought for a moment that would be it, but not 3 minutes of silence had passed by when there was again pounding on the glass and front door. This time though, someone also started banging on the side of the house. And that's when I fully realized that whoever was out there was truly trying to terrify me. This was not simply some dumb kid having a laugh. This was a group of psychos. They knew I was alone, and they knew I was terrified. Hiking some of the most treacherous trails Michigan had to offer, or swimming across the lake every year for swim team in college, jumping out of a plane with the earth getting closer and closer, none of that could have prepared me for the fear I felt that week. The day my parents got back, my dad went into the city and bought 2 motion lights and surveillance cameras for the front and back of the house. Later that month, he bought a gun as well. I rest easy now knowing these defenses exist, but I'll never forget the feeling of utter terror I experienced on those nights 2 years ago. Since then, there's been no further incident. I moved to the city in a small apartment surrounded by neighbors and noise. Whoever terrorized me on that string of nights remains a mystery. They say the only thing to fear is fear itself, but right now my biggest fear is not knowing who did that to me. My boyfriend and our good friend were living in an apartment in our city. To initially get into the large complex, there are security gates that need an access key, then another security door to get to the stairwell of ours and our neighbors. Then there's the unit doors themselves. There had been a few occasions where I'd come home and realized the door to the stairwell was just sitting on the frame without actually closing. I would always make an effort to close it properly as I came and went. On this night, my boyfriend, my flatmate, and another friend were having drinks on a weeknight. It was around 11 when our friend who lives up the road left. Like normal, we went to bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I suddenly woke up. I thought I could hear someone treading on our carpet. I remember audibly gasping because as I opened my eyes, I was confronted by the sight of a silhouette of a man standing in our bedroom. I couldn't make him out very well because my eyes were still adjusting to the light. Immediately, I thought it had to be our flatmate. Maybe we had his car keys or something. It's funny how the brain tries to make sense of a strange situation. To me, this silhouette looked remarkably like our flatmate. I stared at him as he slowly backed out of the room. Then I saw him peer around the doorframe. I couldn't make out his face. "Josh, what do you want?" It was the lack of response that really scared me the most. My flatmate would have at least explained what was going on. Instead, this figure left the doorway. My heart started pounding, and I elbowed my partner, who then woke up. "I think there's someone in the house." I was surprised at how quickly he got up, still half asleep. I watched him leave the room, then heard him call out, "What the hell? Who are you? Get the hell out!" It turns out the guy was waiting in the hallway just out of sight. I don't think he was expecting to be confronted by my partner though. This guy bolted to the door, which he left hanging on its hinges. He was saying sorry over and over. I started screaming. How close this stranger had been, how vulnerable we were sleeping. It was all just so terrifying. This happened about 2 months ago. I was alone in the house as my parents were away working for the weekend. They were due back that evening though. My mom texted me to say they had broken down and were waiting for the tow truck to come pick them up. I asked them if there was anything I could do, but they told me to just go to sleep as they would probably be back late. Fast forward to around 3 a.m. I woke up to use the bathroom. When I left the bathroom, I glanced over to their bedroom. The door was shut, but I could see that the light was on inside. At this point, I should note that when I'd gone to sleep, their bedroom door was open and the light had been off. Of course, I thought they must be home by now. I stumbled toward the door and remember stopping myself thinking I shouldn't bother them. I'd simply talk to them in the morning. I turned back to my room and went back to sleep. The next thing I know though, I'm being awoken by the sound of the front door opening downstairs. I glanced up at the clock, noting it was around 3:45 a.m., 45 minutes after I'd woken up last. I thought it was a bit strange. I got a tense feeling in my stomach. I walked out of my bedroom and glanced over to my parents' room, only to see the door was now open and the light was off. The bed was also neatly made, so clearly no one had been in it. I felt sick. I went downstairs and nervously called out to my mom. "Did you guys just get home?" She responded, "Yeah, why?" I sat staring into space, wondering what the hell just happened.